Owning a ranch, 500 acres of open pasture, a herd of cattle, your name on the gate. The dream is deeply American and entirely uncomplicated. Here is what complicates it. A 5-year analysis of Kansas cow-calf operations from 2016 to 2020, published by Kansas State University agricultural economists, found that every profit tier lost money. High-profit operations averaged a negative return of $108 per cow. Low-profit operations lost $568 per cow. That was not a bad 5 years. That was a complete cattle price cycle. And the people running those operations were experienced, multi-generational ranchers with decades of cost discipline behind them. Here is what this actually costs. The entry point into ranch ownership begins with land, and land has never been more expensive in the history of American agriculture. Land purchase. The USDA reported average pasture land value across the United States at $1,920 per acre in 2025, with average farm real estate at $4,350 per acre. In Texas, the nation's largest cattle-producing state, the statewide median ranch price sits at approximately $4,700 per acre in 2026, per HRC ranch data. Oklahoma, offering comparable grazing quality at lower entry prices, runs $800 to $3,000 per acre for pasture land, per Bar T Realty, mid-2026 transaction data. A functional cow-calf operation requires a minimum of 400 to 600 acres in well-watered grassland country to support 100 breeding cows, the minimum herd size at which per-head economics become competitive. At $3,000 per acre on 500 acres, in a mid-tier market, $1,500,000 in land alone. Breeding cattle. LSU Ag Center estimates for a 100-cow operation put the cost of purchasing bred cows at $220,000, $2,200 per head. 4 bulls at $7,500 each, $30,000. Infrastructure. Perimeter and cross-fencing a 500-acre property costs $250,000 to $400,000, depending on terrain. Working pens and squeeze chute, $15,000 to $40,000. Water infrastructure, wells, pumps, stock tanks, $20,000 to $80,000. Equipment, tractor, hay equipment, feed truck, stock trailer. Used, functional condition, $75,000 to $150,000. Closing costs, buyer's costs, title insurance, agricultural appraisal, legal fees, 3% to 5% of purchase price. On $1,500,000, $60,000. Total entry cost, 100 cow operation, 500 acres, mid-tier market. Land, $1,500,000. Plus cattle, $250,000. Plus fencing, $300,000. Plus closing costs, $60,000. Total before the first calf hits the ground, approximately $2,270,000. Ranch operating costs are structured around the cost per cow, the total annual expense required to maintain 1 breeding cow and produce 1 calf for sale. Feed and hay. University of Kentucky's 2026 cow-calf budget estimates hay cost at $125 per cow annually under normal conditions. On 100 cows, $12,500. A drought extending hay feeding by 60 days at $3.50 per cow per day adds $21,000. Minerals and supplements, $40 per cow per year, per UK 2026 budget. On 100 cows, $4,000. Veterinary and medicine, routine herd health, vaccinations, deworming, pregnancy checking, $25 per cow per year. On 100 cows, $2,500. A scours outbreak can cost $3,000 to $8,000 in a single event. Breeding costs. Bull depreciation and maintenance spread across cows serviced, $45 per cow. On 100 cows, $4,500. Pasture maintenance, mowing, limited fertilization, fencing repair, water system upkeep, $40 per acre per year. On 500 acres, $20,000. Labor, owner-operated with 1 part-time hired hand during calving, $15,000 to $25,000. An absentee owner requiring full-time hired management, faces $40,000 to $70,000 in labor costs. Property taxes. Agricultural valuation in Texas, Oklahoma, and Kansas typically produces $1,500 to $4,000 annually on 500 acres of pasture. Insurance. Livestock, property, and liability. $8,000 to $15,000 per year. Marketing, trucking, and miscellaneous. Sale barn commissions, transport, machinery, fuel, and repairs. $13,700 combined. Annual operating cost summary. Feed $12,500, plus minerals $4,000, plus veterinary $2,500, plus breeding $4,500, plus pasture $20,000, plus labor $20,000, plus taxes $3,000, plus insurance $12,000, plus marketing and MISC $15,200. Total annual operating cost approximately $93,700, and before debt service. With debt service on $1,500,000 in land financing at 7% over 20 years, $139,000 per year. Total annual cash outflow including debt service, approximately $232,700. Ranch revenue comes primarily from calf sales. A 100-cow herd with an 85% weaning rate produces 85 calves per year. In 2026, with the U.S. cattle herd at its smallest size since 1951, driving historically strong prices, 550-pound steer calves are selling at approximately $2.20 per pound. Gross calf revenue, 85 calves at 500 pounds average and $2 a roser per pound, $85,000. Cull cow and bull sales, $12,000. Hunting lease at $8 per acre on 500 acres, $4,000. Total gross revenue, approximately $101,000. Subtract annual operating cost of $93,700. Surplus before debt service of $7,300. Subtract debt service of $139,000. Net income, negative $131,700. The unleveraged owner, who paid cash for the land, earned $7,300 on a $2,270,000 investment, a 0.32% return on capital before any land appreciation. The leveraged owner loses $131,700 per year. The margin without leverage, less than 1/3 of 1%. The margin with leverage, negative $131,700 per year. The external variable that most reliably destroys ranch economics is the cattle price cycle, a roughly 10-year oscillation between high calf prices and deeply negative returns that has repeated with mechanical regularity throughout the history of the American beef industry. Kansas State University's 5-year analysis of 2016 to 2020 captured a full-cycle decline. High-profit operations lost $108 per cow. Low-profit operations lost $568 per cow. The difference between those two groups was not breeding philosophy or market timing. It was cost structure. Specifically, $284 less in cost per cow among the high-profit producers. Drought amplifies the cycle in the most destructive way. The U.S. cattle herd reached its smallest size in decades during 2023 and 2024, as drought forced widespread liquidation across the southern plains and southwest, per Cattle Daily's May 2026 analysis. Ranchers forced to sell cows during drought, at depressed weights, into a liquidation market, sold their productive capital at the bottom of the cycle. When rainfall returned, those same ranchers faced record purchase prices for replacement cattle in a market where calf prices had already recovered. The timing of the forced exit was the financial catastrophe, not the drought itself. Swift & Company's venture into integrated beef production in the early 2000s illustrates the structural failure mode of leveraged ranch and beef economics precisely. Swift acquired large cattle feeding and packing operations, financed with significant debt, vertically integrating from feedlot to processing. When cattle prices weakened in 2002 and feed costs rose simultaneously, the exact input cost versus output price squeeze that characterizes every down cycle, the debt load made the squeeze fatal. Swift filed for bankruptcy in 2002. The operating business was sound. Cattle were well fed. Packing facilities were efficient. The leverage was not designed to survive the industry's standard cyclical variance. This was not operational failure. This was industry structure. A commodity business with fixed land and debt costs, operating in a market where output prices are set by national supply and demand dynamics, entirely outside management control. The pattern is identical at every scale, from a 100-cow family operation to a vertically integrated beef company. Water rights and environmental compliance are the fastest-growing cost and legal risk in Western and Southern ranch operations, invisible in the financials a seller presents at closing. In Texas, water rights are governed by groundwater conservation districts that vary by county and can impose new pumping restrictions, mandatory metering, and permit fees with limited advance notice. Legal representation in a water dispute costs $15,000 to $60,000 per proceeding before any ruling is issued. Environmental compliance for operations expanding above concentration thresholds triggers EPA and state CAFO permit requirements, covering manure management, stream setback compliance, and stormwater runoff standards. Enforcement actions against ranching operations have resulted in penalties ranging from $5,000 to $150,000 per incident, depending on severity. The most acute systemic risk is a weather event, a flood moving manure into an adjacent creek that triggers simultaneous regulatory action and a neighboring property claim. A single documented water quality incident in Texas has generated enforcement costs and legal defense fees exceeding $200,000 in documented cases. A single environmental compliance failure can generate penalties and legal costs that exceed the ranch's entire annual operating surplus. This can end the business's financial viability in a single event. What gets better at scale? Per head input costs decline above 300 breeding cows. Mineral purchasing in bulk generates 15 to 20% discounts. Ranches large enough to grow their own hay, typically above 800 acres in well-watered country, convert a major cash outflow to a break-even line. Large volume uniform calf lots sell for 5 to 15 cents per pound, above small lot prices at sale barns. What gets harder? Labor scales faster than revenue. A 300-cow operation requires full-time year-round hired labor at $45,000 to $65,000 annually per employee that a 100-cow owner-operated ranch does not carry. Water infrastructure maintenance across 2,000 acres requires $20,000 to $40,000 annually that a 500-acre operation does not. Estate planning complexity grows materially with land value. A $5 million ranch creates an estate tax event at the owner's death that can force a sale or partition if the next generation lacks liquidity. At a certain size, this is a completely different business. A 1,000-cow operation on 5,000 acres is a land company, a livestock production business, a labor management organization, and an environmental compliance operation that also has cows calving in February. Optimistic. Owner purchases 500 acres debt-free, a $1,150,000 land investment funded by prior capital. Cattle purchased with $250,000 in equity, no debt service. First full year, 85 calves at 500 pounds, $2 per pound, $85,000 gross calf revenue. Cull cows and hunting lease, $16,000. Total gross revenue, $101,000. Annual operating cost, $93,700. Net operating income, $7,300. Invested, 0.42%. Land appreciates 4.5%, $67,500 paper gain. Total return including appreciation, approximately 4.3%. Realistic. A drought cuts spring grass by 40% in June. Emergency hay for 90 additional days at $3.50 per cow, $31,500. Weaning rate drops to 78% due to heat stress. 78 calves marketed instead of 85. Calf prices soften 10% from peak, $1.98 per pound. Revised calf revenue, $76,440. A fence line dispute with an adjacent property generates $18,000 in legal fees. Revised revenue, $76,440. Unplanned costs, $49,500. Revised net income, negative $47,460. In a drought year with one legal dispute, events that occur across ranching regions annually, the unleveraged operation produces a $47,000 loss. The difference between those two scenarios is a drought, a 7% weaning rate reduction, and a fence dispute. None of these are exotic disasters. All three happen to someone in this industry every week. USDA agricultural census data shows that the majority of the approximately 619,000 beef cow operations in the United States operate at fewer than 50 cows, a scale at which per-head economics cannot generate sufficient income to pay a living wage, independent of off-farm employment. The primary cause of financial failure in ranching is not drought or market cycles in isolation. It is purchasing ranch land at market value prices with conventional leverage and attempting to service that debt with cattle income alone. The cattle income is structurally insufficient at any realistic scale to service land debt at current land prices. Survivors share 5 habits. First, they acquired land at below market basis, through estate purchase, long-term lease to own, or generational transfer, that gave them a cost structure viable on cattle income. A rancher carrying land at $800 per acre historical cost has $1.5 million less in debt than a buyer purchasing at $3,800 per acre today on the same 500 acres. That gap defines whether cattle income covers debt service. Second, they diversified revenue before the cattle price turned down. Hunting leases, agritourism, conservation reserve program payments, and direct-to-consumer beef sales provided income streams that continued generating cash when calf prices compressed. Survivors in the 2016 to 2020 down cycle derived 30% or more of gross income from non-cattle sources, per Kansas State research. Third, they tracked cost per cow monthly, not annually. The Kansas State 5-year analysis found the gap between high-profit and low-profit operations was $284 per cow, entirely in cost, not revenue. Survivors knew their cost per cow precisely at any point in the year and had specific protocols for reducing variable costs when prices weakened. Reducing stocking rates, selling open cows earlier, delaying non-essential capital expenditures. Fourth, they maintained a minimum 12-month operating reserve in liquid accounts before the first drought. At $93,700 in annual operating cost, that is $93,700 in cash, reserved outside the operation. Ranchers forced to sell cows during drought because they lacked reserves sold productive capital at the worst point in the cycle. Those who held reserves bought replacement cattle at the trough. Fifth, they treated land appreciation as a long-term benefit, not an annual income source. Texas pasture land increased 4.5% from 2024 to 2025, per USDA data. Survivors understood this gain was captured at sale or estate transfer, not in the annual operating budget. They did not refinance appreciating land to fund operating losses. The image is 500 acres of open pasture, your name on the gate. The reality is $2,270,000 in entry costs, a cattle operation producing 0.32% return on capital in the best market in 74 years, and a debt structure requiring $131,700 in annual subsidy when land is financed at market rates. Ranch ownership is not a cattle business. It is a land business that happens to run cattle, and the land is the only part of the equation that builds wealth over time.